The vertebral column consists of various vertebrae. These are the bones, vertebrae. The sacrum, which are fused vertebrae, and the coccyx, which you know is your tailbone, which are also fused vertebrae. And spanning the joints between those vertebrae are intervertebral discs. Those intervertebral discs allow some movement between vertebrae, and they also act as little shock absorbers between the vertebrae. Also notice that the vertebral column is S or sigmoid shaped. This allows it to behave sort of like a spring as you run and jump. It dissipates some of the energy that otherwise would go directly to your head, possibly causing trauma to your head and structures of your head. The vertebrae are subdivided by region. You have the cervical vertebrae of the neck. You have the thoracic vertebrae of the thorax. These vertebrae also articulate with the ribs. You have the lumbar vertebrae of the lower back. And then you have the sacrum, which consists of fused vertebrae, as well as the coccyx, which also consists of fused vertebrae. The vertebral column, of course, protects the oh so important spinal cord. Also note these little holes here. These are intervertebral foramen nerves called spinal nerves that pass from the spinal cord and radiate laterally, pass through these foramen. So I mentioned that you have vertebrae that are named by region. You have to know how many of the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae there are. And there's an easy little saying that you can use to remember that. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. So remember, breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. You will be responsible for being able to distinguish between the 3 vertebrae, cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. So let's talk about the distinguishing characteristics of each. You're looking at a cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae are going to be the easiest to identify because they have foramen that no other vertebrae have. These foramen here are the transverse foramen. Only cervical vertebrae have them. Neither thoracic nor lumbar vertebrae have them. They allow blood vessels to pass up the neck. So if you are asked, what type of vertebrae is this, and you see these transverse foramen, you know 100% you're looking at cervical vertebrae. Thoracic vertebrae, shown here, have some distinguishing characteristics that will be helpful in identifying them as well. Their vertebral foramen, that's this foramen here where the spinal cord passes through, tends to be very round, almost perfectly round. Their spinous process, which extends posteriorly, tends to be very downward pointing. Those two features, very round vertebral foramen and a very downward pointing spinous process, should help you identify them. Lumbar vertebrae will have a vertebral foramen that is heart-shaped, or in this case it looks almost like a circle that was sort of pushed down on top. But it will not be that perfect round shape that we saw with the thoracic vertebrae. They also will tend to have a sort of a short hatchet-shaped spinous process. Also, the lumbar vertebrae are the largest of the vertebrae. As you go down the vertebral column, the vertebrae get bigger and bigger because they have to bear more and more weight. If you are identifying vertebrae in person, that could be helpful. From images, if you're having to identify them, it's probably not as helpful, but they are the larger of the vertebrae. There are two vertebrae which you must know by name. They are the first and the second vertebrae. They will not be very difficult to distinguish. They have very unique characteristics. First, let's talk about the first cervical vertebrae. The first cervical vertebrae is the atlas, shown here. And this is what an actual vertebrae looks like. The atlas has the following distinguishing features. One has these two large depressions here. Do you remember the occipital condyles of the skull? They rest right on these depressions and they pivot across them and allows you to shake your head. Yes, as in, yes, I will study 20 hours a week, my ANP. Another distinguishing characteristic is the atlas does not have a body. The body is the load-bearing portion of the vertebrae. Here is the body of this vertebrae. It's what bears the weight. A atlas does not have a body. So those are two characteristics that will make it very easy to identify the atlas. Atlas is the Roman Titan in Greek and Roman mythology that holds up the world. And that is why a world map is called an atlas. So just think of the atlas, the vertebrae, holding up your world, your head. The second cervical vertebrae is called the axis. The atlas rests and pivots around this structure here, which is called the dens or odontoid process. Most students refer to it as the dens. Either is fine. The atlas pivots around the dens and allows you to shake your head no. Here is an actual picture of actual photo of an axis, and you can see this dens makes it very easy to identify. I also want to add that you will have to identify the various anatomical structures of a typical vertebrae as shown here. I won't go through the details. The structures you have to identify are listed on your study guide, and there are very good images in your textbook and lab manual.